I was pet sitting for an old friend, Rachel. She had a job that required her to travel a lot, and when she couldn't take her dog Max with her, I'd step in. Max was a big, friendly German shepherd with a calm demeanor. He was easy to care for, and her place was only a few miles from mine, so it was never a hassle. One Friday night, I went over to Rachel's house to stay with Max for the weekend. Rachel had left me the usual instructions: feeding schedule, his favorite treats, and the spare key hidden in the potted plant by the door. She also mentioned in her note that Max had been acting a bit strange lately. When I pressed her on the phone about it, she brushed it off, saying he was probably just restless because she was packing a lot. I didn't think much of it. Max was getting older, and I figured maybe he was a little out of sorts. I got to her house around 8 p.m. Max greeted me with his usual enthusiasm, tail wagging as he trotted around, showing off his favorite toys. The night passed uneventfully at first. I cooked myself some dinner, watched TV, and eventually settled in the living room with Max curled up by my feet. I figured it would be an easy night. But around 11:30 p.m., things started to feel off. It was subtle at first, just a creeping sense that I wasn't alone, even though it was only me and Max in the house. I shrugged it off as paranoia. Staying in someone else's house can sometimes do that, right? Then Max's ears perked up. His gaze fixed intently on the front door, and he let out a low, almost inaudible growl. It sent a chill down my spine. Max wasn't the type to growl for no reason. I tried to calm him down, scratching behind his ears and whispering to him, but his gaze never wavered from that door. His growl grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel his tension under my hand. I stood up, my heart racing a little, and checked the peephole. There was no one there, just the dark, empty street. I took a deep breath, convinced myself it was nothing, and settled back on the couch, though I couldn't quite relax. I kept glancing at the front door, expecting something to happen. An hour passed. Max had finally settled down, his head resting on his paws, though his eyes would flick back toward the door every so often. I decided I should probably head to bed. I took Max to Rachel's room and let him settle on the floor near the bed. I turned off the lights, got under the covers, and tried to drift off to sleep. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard it. A faint scratching sound at the front door. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like someone running their nails lightly against the wood. I held my breath, listening intently, trying to convince myself it was just a branch or maybe some animal outside. But deep down, I knew it was neither. This was deliberate, a slow, scratching movement, almost teasing in its patience. Max started growling again, his body stiffening as he stared at the bedroom door, as if he could see through it to the front entrance. My heart was hammering. I tried to calm him, but I was terrified myself. Every time the scratching stopped, there was this eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever, only to be broken again by that sound. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That I heard scratching at the door. It was hardly an emergency, and I felt a little foolish even considering it. Then the scratching stopped entirely and silence filled the house. I lay there, straining to hear any sound, any hint of movement. But it was dead quiet. After a few minutes, I managed to convince myself it was over. I was just about to turn over and try to sleep when I heard something that nearly made my heart stop. The doorknob was turning. It was slow and deliberate, the metal creaking as if someone was trying to be quiet but failing. I could feel Max tensing up again, his growl growing louder and more aggressive. My mind raced, running through all the possibilities. Maybe it was Rachel coming back early, but I hadn't heard her car, and she would have called. Maybe it was a neighbor or someone who had the wrong house, but it was well past 2 a.m. I held my breath, clutching the phone in my hand, ready to call 911, when the knob stopped turning. The silence felt heavier this time, like it was pressing down on me thick and suffocating. I didn't dare move. I could feel Max's body trembling beside me, his growl now a constant rumble. Then, the scratching started again, this time more frantic, like whoever or whatever was out there was growing impatient. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped out of bed and flipped on the lights, hoping the sudden brightness would scare off whoever was outside. But when I opened the bedroom door and peeked down the hall, there was no one there. Just the empty hallway leading to the front door, which was still locked, the doorknob perfectly still. Max followed me down the hallway, his body pressed close to mine. I reached the door, took a deep breath, and looked through the peephole. Nothing. Just the still empty street, bathed in the dim glow of the street lamp. I double-checked the lock, made sure the windows were secured, and went back to the bedroom, my nerves frayed. The rest of the night passed in a tense silence. I didn't sleep. Max stayed close, his eyes never leaving the door. I kept expecting to hear that scratching again, that slow turn of the doorknob, but it never came. The house remained silent, almost as if whatever was out there had given up. For now. By the time morning came, I was exhausted. I packed my things and left a quick note for Rachel, telling her I wasn't feeling well and had to leave early. As I was backing out of the driveway, I glanced up at the house one last time. That's when I saw it. There was a figure in the upstairs window watching me. It was just a silhouette, shadowed and indistinct, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unwavering. I couldn't make out any details, but I didn't need to. I knew somehow that whoever had been outside last night had found their way in. I drove away, my hands shaking on the wheel, and I haven't been back since. Rachel moved a few months later, saying she felt like the house had an off vibe she couldn't shake. She mentioned that Max had never quite been the same after that night, growing anxious and jumpy even in his new home. To this day, I wonder who, or what, was trying to get into that house that night, and if it ever left. I didn't usually pet sit, but when my friend Molly asked me to take care of her dog while she went out of town, I figured why not. I'd met Rocky before, a big, goofy lab mix who couldn't hurt a fly if he tried. Plus, Molly was offering good money, so I agreed to spend a few nights at her place. When I arrived, Molly showed me around her cozy little bungalow. She pointed out the essentials: dog food in the kitchen, treats in a jar by the door, and the spare key under the potted plant. Then she led me to the basement door, an old wooden thing tucked away at the end of the hallway. "Whatever you do," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "don't go into the basement. It's old and creepy, and Rocky hates it down there. He'll bark his head off if you try." I chuckled, thinking she was just exaggerating. "Got it. Basement is off limits." She nodded, her eyes lingering on the door just a second too long. "Thanks, really," she said, looking almost relieved. That first night was uneventful. Rocky and I settled on the couch, watching TV until I drifted off with him snoring by my feet. But sometime in the middle of the night, I jolted awake, disoriented. The house was still and dark, save for the faint glow of a street lamp filtering through the blinds. That's when I heard it, a low, faint scratching sound. I figured Rocky needed to go out, so I sat up, rubbing my eyes. But Rocky wasn't at the door. He was sitting at the end of the hall, staring at the basement door. His hackles were raised, and he was whining softly, almost like he was afraid. "Rocky?" I whispered, approaching him. He turned his head, looking at me with eyes wide and tense. The scratching had stopped, but my heart was racing. I told myself it was just an old house creaking. But when I coaxed Rocky back to the living room, he kept glancing back down the hall, uneasy. The second night, things got stranger. Around midnight, I heard the scratching again. This time it was louder, more insistent, like nails dragging across wood. And then came a low, rhythmic tapping, almost like someone was knocking from the inside. I crept out of bed, my skin prickling with every step. Rocky was nowhere to be seen, but I could hear him whimpering softly. As I got closer to the basement door, the sounds stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. I stood there, staring at the door, feeling like something was staring back at me. Then, from the darkness behind me, I heard a soft click. I spun around, my pulse pounding in my ears, but there was nothing there. Just shadows. I found Rocky in the kitchen, curled up under the table, shaking. I'd never seen a dog look so terrified. The next day I called Molly, trying to keep my voice casual. "Hey, so, is there any chance there's, I don't know, some kind of animal stuck in the basement?" Molly was silent for a moment. "No, I don't think so." "Why?" I didn't want to freak her out, so I just said I'd heard some weird noises and thought maybe a raccoon had found its way in. But she sounded nervous, almost defensive. "It's probably just the old pipes. Don't worry about it, remember, just stay out of the basement." I hung up, feeling more uneasy than ever. On the third night, things escalated. Rocky refused to even come into the hallway, so I settled him in the living room and closed the bedroom door, hoping to drown out any more noises. But it was no use. Just after midnight, I heard it again. Scratching, tapping, and something else. A soft, raspy whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like someone trying to speak, just on the other side of the basement door. My hands were shaking as I pressed my ear to the door, and I heard it clear as day. "Let me out." I stumbled back, my heart hammering. I wanted to call Molly, to demand an explanation, but my phone was dead. I ran back to the living room, finding Rocky huddled in a corner, staring at me with wide, fearful eyes. Then the sound of a door creaking open echoed down the hallway. I turned to see the basement door slowly swinging inward, opening into a yawning darkness. I froze, my mind racing with terror, but I couldn't move. Something cold and heavy seemed to press down on me, pinning me in place. And then I saw it. A figure stood at the top of the basement stairs, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly arms that reached out toward me, its fingers curling like claws. Its eyes were empty pits, blacker than the darkness around it, and its mouth hung open in a silent scream. I backed away, tripping over a rug and crashing to the floor. The figure took a step forward, its joints creaking like rusty hinges. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing Rocky and bolting for the front door. As I fumbled with the lock, I heard it, whispering my name. I threw the door open and ran into the night, not stopping until I was several blocks away, my lungs burning and Rocky trembling in my arms. The next morning, Molly called me, sounding annoyed. "I thought I told you not to go in the basement." "I didn't," I shouted, the fear and frustration boiling over. "But someone was in there." She was silent for a long time. "Look," she said finally, her voice low and tense. "I didn't want to say anything, but there's a reason I told you to stay out of the basement. The previous owner, well, let's just say he didn't leave the house voluntarily, and they never found his body." I felt a chill run down my spine. What happened to him?" She hesitated, then whispered, "They say he went mad, convinced something was trying to lure him into the basement. One night he vanished. Some people think he's still there, waiting, watching." I hung up, feeling the weight of the horror I'd escaped. I never went back to Molly's house, and I haven't spoken to her since. But sometimes in the dead of night, I swear I can still hear it. A soft, insistent tapping just outside my door. I should have known from the moment I stepped inside the house that something wasn't quite right. The air was thick with tension, like the house itself was holding its breath. But at the time, I was just excited to make some extra cash. A friend of a friend had asked me to pet sit for a couple of weeks, and I needed the money. The job seemed simple enough. Take care of a parrot, feed it, clean its cage, and make sure the place didn't burn down. How hard could it be? The owner, a middle-aged woman named Helen, had shown me around the house briefly before leaving for her trip. Her parrot, named Sparky, was perched in a large, ornate cage near the window in the living room. Sparky was an African gray, and Helen had spoken proudly of how intelligent he was. "He talks. A lot," she had warned me. But it was clear from the way she said it that she didn't mind. I wasn't concerned. I liked animals, and parrots were one of the easier creatures to care for. At least that's what I thought. That first night, everything seemed normal. I stayed at the house, settling into the guest room Helen had prepared for me. Sparky greeted me with his usual squawk whenever I walked past the living room, but I didn't think much of it. He wasn't exactly friendly, but then again, parrots are known for their odd behaviors. I figured he was just being his usual unpredictable self. But by the second night, things started to take a strange turn. Sparky's squawks became more deliberate, almost like he was trying to say something. I'd be lying in bed, trying to sleep, and suddenly I'd hear his voice, clear as day, calling my name. Hey, come here. I froze, wide awake. The voice wasn't Helen's. It wasn't even a voice I recognized. I chalked it up to the parrot mimicking sounds. They do that, right? But this wasn't a random squawk or a jumbled mess of words. It sounded almost too real. I got out of bed, walked to the living room, and found Sparky sitting in his cage, staring at me. His beady eyes followed my every movement. Come here, the voice repeated. This time it was more urgent, more demanding. I stared at the parrot, confused and a little unsettled. Was it possible he'd been trained to say that? I'd read that some parrots could learn to mimic specific phrases from their owners, but this felt different. There was an eerie weight to it, almost like it was coming from somewhere else. I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the strange feeling creeping up my spine. Come here now, the voice demanded. I shook my head, nervously laughing to myself. I must have been hearing things. I walked closer to the cage, but as soon as I did, Sparky went silent, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I reached into the cage to adjust his food bowl, and the moment my hand touched the bars, Sparky let out a high-pitched screech, louder than I'd ever heard him before. It was so sudden and piercing, I nearly jumped out of my skin. I quickly backed away, heart racing. Sparky didn't stop staring at me. His eyes weren't the innocent, curious eyes of a bird. They were cold, almost predatory. Something was off, but I couldn't figure out what. That night I tried to sleep, but the unease never left me. I kept hearing things. The creak of the floorboards, soft thuds from the hallway, like footsteps. But whenever I checked, the house was empty. Except for Sparky. He'd be watching me, his eyes glinting in the dark. The next few days were worse. Sparky's strange behavior escalated. He began repeating phrases I didn't recognize, words that didn't make sense. They're here, he would whisper, low and slow. Then, in the dead of night, I heard him say something that made my blood run cold. Don't let them in. At first, I thought maybe Helen had left a recording or something, but I checked. There was nothing. The parrot was just speaking on his own. It didn't make any sense. The house felt oppressive, like something was lurking just out of sight, waiting. And it wasn't just Sparky's behavior that was unsettling. The house itself felt wrong. The temperature seemed to fluctuate for no reason. One minute it would be freezing, and the next it would be sweltering hot. Lights flickered and strange shadows seemed to shift in the corners of the rooms. I could hear whispers at night, faint and indistinct, as if someone was talking just beyond the walls. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I couldn't explain any of it, but I knew something was horribly wrong. One afternoon, I decided to get a little more aggressive. I stood in front of Sparky's cage and stared at him. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why are you saying these things?" Sparky cocked his head to the side, watching me with an unnerving focus. Then, as if he understood the question, he answered, "They're watching." I stepped back, my heart pounding. The voice wasn't just a mimic anymore, it was different, clearer, darker. It felt like it was coming from somewhere deeper than Sparky. That evening I had a breakdown. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt like I was being watched. The whispers grew louder. The air in the house was suffocating. And Sparky's voice, it kept calling to me, repeating things I didn't want to hear. The next morning, I finally couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and called Helen, hoping she would come home early. When she answered, I barely let her say hello before I blurted out, "There's something wrong with the bird. I can't explain it, but it's like he's talking to me. I don't know how to deal with it." There was a long pause before she responded. "What do you mean, talking to you?" Her voice was strangely calm, almost too calm. I was too frantic to make sense of my words, but I managed to get out the basics of what had been happening. Helen listened without interruption. When I finished, she said something that made my blood run cold. "I told you not to let him talk. You should never have let him talk." I was confused. "What do you mean?" "He's a parrot, Helen. He talks." There was a long silence on the other end. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost a whisper. "Sparky doesn't just mimic. He learns. He learns from the ones who come to visit." I froze, unable to speak. She continued, her tone now frantic. "He's been talking to you because he's found you. You're the one who will open the door." And then, just as I was about to respond, I heard it. Sparky's voice, coming from behind me, louder than before. "Don't let them in." I dropped the phone. The call had ended, but the house was silent now. Too silent. I turned around, but Sparky was staring at me from his cage. His eyes gleamed with something darker than I'd ever seen before. And then, I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, just for a second, something moved in the shadows of the hallway. Something watching, waiting. I grabbed my things and ran. I didn't stop until I was miles away, but even now, I still hear Sparky's voice echoing in my mind. "Don't let them in."